History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4, The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 6, India. The reign of Babur's son, troubled by his own instability and inadequacy, and by the presence of half brothers anxious to exploit the Timurid tradition, which, like the Frankish, prescribed the division of a royal inheritance, showed that the security and consolidation of Babur's realm could not be taken for granted. For 5 years of his reign, he was driven from Delhi, though he returned there to die in 1555. His heir, Akbar, born during his father's distressed wanderings, but enjoying the advantages of a very auspicious horoscope and the absence of rival brothers, thus came to the throne as a boy. He inherited at first only a small part of his grandfather's domains, but was to build from them an empire recalling that of Ashoka, winning the awed respect of Europeans who called him the Great Mughal. Akbar had many kingly qualities. He was brave to the point of folly. His most obvious weakness was that he was headstrong, enjoying as a boy riding his own fighting elephants and preferring hunting and hawking to lessons. One consequence was that, uniquely in Babur's line, he was almost illiterate. He once killed a tiger with his sword in single combat and was proud of his marksmanship with the gun. Babur had introduced firearms to the Mughal army. Yet he was also, like his predecessors, an admirer of learning and all things beautiful. He collected books, and his reign marked the peak of Mughal architecture and painting, a department of court painters being maintained at his expense. Above all, he was statesmanlike in his handling of the problems posed by religious differences among his subjects. Akbar reigned for almost half a century, until 1605, thus just overlapping at each end the reign of his contemporary Queen Elizabeth I of England. Among his first acts on reaching maturity was to marry a Rajput princess who was, of course, a Hindu. Marriage always played an important part in Akbar's diplomacy and strategy, and this lady, the mother of the next emperor, was the daughter of the greatest of the Rajput kings, and therefore an important catch. Nonetheless, something more than policy may be seen in the marriage. Akbar had already permitted the Hindu ladies of his harem to practice the rites of their own religion within it, an unprecedented act for a Muslim ruler. Before long, he abolished the poll tax on non-Muslims. He was going to be the emperor of all religions, not a Muslim fanatic. Akbar even went on to listen to Christian teachers. He invited the Portuguese who had appeared on the west coast to send missionaries learned in their faith to his court, and 3 Jesuits duly arrived there in 1580. They disputed vigorously with Muslim divines before the emperor and received many marks of his favor, though they were disappointed in their long indulged hope of his conversion. He seems, in fact, to have been a man of genuine religious feeling and eclectic mind. He went on so far as to try to institute a new religion of his own, a sort of mishmash of Zoroastrianism, Islam, and Hinduism. It had little success except among prudent courtiers and offended some. However this is interpreted, it is evident that the appeasement of non-Muslims would ease the problems of the government in India. Babur's advice in his memoirs to conciliate defeated enemies pointed in this direction too. For Akbar launched himself on a career of conquest and added many new Hindu territories to his empire. He rebuilt the unity of the northern India from Gujarat to Bengal and began the conquest of the Deccan. The empire was governed by a system of administration, much of which lasted well into the era of British Raj, though Akbar was less an innovator in government than the confirmer and establisher of institutions he inherited. Officials ruled in the emperor's name, and at his pleasure, they had the primary function of providing soldiers as needed and raising the land tax, now reassessed on an empire-wide and more flexible system devised by a Hindu finance minister. This seems to have had an almost unmatched success in that it actually led to increases in production, which raised the standard of living in Hindustan. Among other reforms, which were notable in intention if not in effect, was the discouragement of sutti. Above all, Akbar stabilized the regime. He was disappointed in his sons and quarreled with them. Yet the dynasty was solidly based when he died. There were revolts nevertheless. Some of them seem to have been encouraged by Muslim anger at Akbar's apparent falling away from the faith. Even in the Turkish era, the sharpness of the religious distinction between Muslims and non Muslims had somewhat softened as invaders settled down in their new country and took up Indian ways. One earlier sign of assimilation was the appearance of a new language, Urdu, the tongue of the camp. It was the lingua franca of rulers and ruled, with a Hindi structure and a Persian and Turkish vocabulary. Soon there were signs that the omnivorous power of Hinduism would perhaps even incorporate Islam. A new devotionalism in the 14th and 15th centuries had spread through popular hymns, an abstract, almost monotheistic cult of a god whose name might be Rama or Allah, but who offered love, justice, and mercy to all men. Correspondingly, some Muslims, even before Akbar's reign, had shown interest in and respect for Hindu ideas. There was some absorption of Hindu ritual practice. Soon it was noticeable that converts to Islam tended to revere the tombs of holy men. These became places of resort and pilgrimage which satisfied the scheme of a subordinate focus of devotion in a monotheistic religion, and thus carried out the functions of the minor and local deities who had always found a place in Hinduism. Another important development before the end of Akbar's reign was the consolidation of India's first direct relations with Atlantic Europe. Links with Mediterranean Europe may already have been made slightly easier by the coming of Islam. From the Levant to Delhi, a common religion provided continuous, if distant, contact. European travelers had turned up from time to time in India, and its rulers had been able to attract the occasional technical expert to their service, though they were few after the Ottoman conquests. But what was now about to happen was to go much further and would change India forever. The Europeans who now arrived would be followed by others in increasing numbers, and they would not go away. The process had begun with a Portuguese admiral reached Malabar at the end of 15th century. Within a few years, his countrymen had installed themselves as traders and behaved sometimes as pirates at Bombay and on the coast of Gujarat. Attempts to dislodge them failed in the troubled years following Babur's death, and in the second half of the century, the Portuguese moved around to found new posts in the Bay of Bengal. They made the running of Europeans in India for a long time. They were liable, nonetheless, to attract the hostility of good Muslims because they brought with them pictures and images of Christ, Mary, and the saints which smacked of idolatry. Protestants were to prove less irritating to religious feeling when they arrived. The British age in India was still a long way off, but with rare historical neatness, the first British East India Company was founded on 31st December 1600, the last day of 16th century. 3 years later, the company's first emissary arrived at Akbar's court in Agra, and by then Elizabeth I, who had given the merchants their charter of incorporation, was dead. Thus, at the end of the reigns of the two great rulers came the first contact between the two countries, whose historical destinies were to be entwined so long and with such enormous effect for them both and for the world. At that moment, no hint of such a future could have been sensed. The English then regarded trade in India as less interesting than that with other parts of Asia. The contrast between the two realms, too, is fascinating. Akbar's empire was one of the most powerful in the world. His court, one of the most sumptuous, and he and his successors ruled over a civilization more glorious and spectacular than anything India had known since the Guptas, while Queen Elizabeth's kingdom, barely a great power, even in European terms, was crippled by debt and contained fewer people than modern Calcutta. Akbar's successor was contemptuous of his presents sent to him by James I a few years later. Yet the future of India lay with the subjects of the Queen. The Mughal emperors continued in Babur's line in direct descent, though not without interruption, until the middle of the 19th century. After Akbar, so great was the dynasty's prestige that it became fashionable in India to claim Mughal descent. Only the three rulers who followed Akbar mattered here. For it was under Jahangir and Shah Jahan that the empire grew to its greatest extent in the first half of the 17th century, and under Aurangzeb that it began to decay in the second. The reign of Jahangir was not so glorious as his father's, but the empire survived his cruelty and alcoholism, a considerable test of its administrative structure. The religious toleration established by Akbar also survived intact. For all his faults, though, Jahangir was a notable promoter of the arts, above all of painting. During his reigns, there becomes visible for the first time the impact of European culture in Asia through artistic motifs drawn from imported pictures and prints. One of these motifs was the halo or nimbus given to Christian saints and, in Byzantium, to emperors. After Jahangir, all Mughal emperors were painted with it. Shah Jahan began the piecemeal acquisition of the Deccan Sultanates, though he had little success in campaigns in the northwest and failed to drive the Persians from Kandahar. In domestic administration, there was a weakening of the principle of religious toleration, though not sufficiently to place Hindus at a disadvantage in the government service. Administration remained multi religious. Although the emperor decreed that all newly built Hindu temples should be pulled down, he patronized Hindu poets and musicians. At Agra, Shah Jahan maintained a lavish and exquisite court life. It was there too that he built the most celebrated and best known of all Islamic buildings, the Taj Mahal, a tomb for his favorite wife. It is the only possible rival to the Mosque of Cordoba for the title of the most beautiful building in the world. She had died soon after Shah Jahan's accession, and for over 20 years his builders were at work. It is the culmination of the work with arc and dome, which is one of the most conspicuous Islamic legacies to Indian art and the greatest monument of Islam in India. The waning of Indian representational sculpture after the Islamic invasions had its compensations. Shah Jahan's court brought also to its culmination a great tradition of miniature painting. Below the level of the court, the picture of Mughal India is far less attractive. Local officials had to raise more and more money to support not only the household expenses and campaigns of Shah Jahan, but also the social and military elites who were essentially parasitic on the producing economy, without regard for local need or natural disaster. A rapacious tax gathering machine may at times have been taking from the peasant producer as much as half his income. Virtually none of this was productively invested. The flight of peasants from the land and the rise of rural banditry is a telling symptom of the suffering and the resistance these extractions provoked. Yet even Shah Jahan's demands probably did the empire less damage than the religious enthusiasm of his third son, Aurangzeb, who set aside three brothers and imprisoned his father to become emperor in 1658. He combined disastrously absolute power, distrust of his subordinates, and a narrow religiosity. To have succeeded in reducing the expenses of his court is not much of an offsetting item in the account. New conquests were balanced by revolts against Mughal rule, which were said to owe much to Aurangzeb's attempt to prohibit the Hindu religion and destroy its temple, and to his restoration of the poll tax on non Muslims. The Hindus' advancement in the service of the state was less and less likely. Conversion became necessary for success. A century of religious toleration was cancelled, and one result was the alienation of many subjects' loyalties. Among other results, this helped to make it impossible finally to conquer the Deccan, which has been termed the ulcer which ruined the Mughal Empire. As under Ashoka, North and South India could not be united. The Mahatras, the hillmen, who were the core of Hindu opposition, constituted themselves under an independent ruler in 1674. They allied with the remains of the Muslim armies of the Deccan Sultans to resist the Mughal armies in a long struggle which threw up a heroic figure who has become something of a paladin in the eyes of modern Hindu nationalists. This was Shivaji, who built from fragments a Maratha political identity which soon enabled him to exploit the taxpayer as ruthlessly as the Mughal had done. Aurangzeb was continuously campaigning against the Mahatras, down to his death in 1707. There followed a grave crisis for the regime, for his three sons disputed the succession. The empire almost at once began to break up, and much more formidable legatee than the Hindu or local prince was waiting in the wings, the European. Perhaps the negative responsibility for the eventual success of the Europeans in India is Akbar's, for he did not scotch the serpent in the egg. Shah Jahan, on the other hand, destroyed the Portuguese station on the Hooghly, though Christians were later tolerated at Agra. Strikingly, Mughal policy never seemed to have envisaged the building of a navy, a weapon used formidably against the Mediterranean Europeans by the Ottomans. One consequence was already felt under Aurangzeb, when the coastal shipping and even the pilgrim trade to Makkah were in danger from the Europeans. On land, the Europeans had been allowed to establish their toeholds and bridgeheads. After beating a Portuguese squadron, the English won their first West Coast trading concession early in the 17th century. Then, in 1639, on the Bay of Bengal, and with the permission of the local ruler, they founded at Madras the first settlement of British India, Fort St. George. The headstones over their graves in its little cemetery still commemorate the first English who lived and died in India, as would thousands more for over 3 centuries. The English later fell foul of Aurangzeb, but got further stations at Bombay and Calcutta before the end of the century. Their ships had maintained the paramountcy in trade won from the Portuguese. But a new European rival was also in sight by 1700. A French East India Company had been founded in 1664 and soon established its own settlements. A century of conflict lay ahead, but not only between the newcomers. Europeans were already having to make nice political choices because of the uncertainties aroused when Mughal power was no longer as strong as it once had been. Relations had to be opened with his opponents as well as with the emperor, as the English in the Bombay discovered looking on helplessly while a Maratha squadron occupied one island in Bombay harbour and a Mughal admiral the one next to it. In 1677, an official sent back a significant warning to his employers in London. The times now require you to manage your general commerce with your sword in your hands. By 1700, the English were well aware that much was at stake. With that date, we are into the era in which India is increasingly caught up in the events not of her own making, the era of world history, in fact. Little things show it as well as great. In the 16th century, the Portuguese had brought with them chili, potatoes, and tobacco from America. Indian diet and agriculture were already changing. Soon, maize, papayas, and pineapple were to follow. The story of Indian civilization and rulers can be broken once this new connection with the larger world is achieved. Yet it was not the coming of the Europeans which ended the great period of Mughal Empire. That was merely coincidental, though it was important that newcomers were there to reap the advantages. No Indian empire had ever been able to maintain itself for long. The diversity of the subcontinent and the failure of its rulers to find ways to tap indigenous popular loyalty are probably the main explanation. India remained a continent of exploitative ruling elites and productive peasants upon whom they battened. The states, if the term can be used, were only machinery for transferring resources from producers to parasites. The means by which they did this destroyed the incentive to save, to invest productively. India was, by the end of 17th century, ready for another set of conquerors. They were awaiting their cue, already on stage, but as yet playing hardly more than bit parts. Yet in the long run, the European tide would recede as well. Unlike early conquerors, though Europeans were to stay a long time, they were not to be overcome by India's assimilative power as their predecessors had been. They would go away defeated, but would not be swallowed. And when they went, they would leave a deeper imprint than any of their predecessors because they would leave true state structures behind.